Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating Headless Content Management. My name is Siobhan Fagan. I'm the Managing Editor of CMS Wire, and I am very happy to be the moderator for today's webinar. Before we get into the content, just a little bit of housekeeping. Right now we are in the middle of the introductions. That will take 5 minutes, maybe a little bit quicker since I speak quickly. And then we're going to have 35 to 40 minutes of presentation by today's presenters. Then finally, we would love to hear your questions for the presenters. We're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes to answer your questions. So please submit them at any point during the webinar using the module on the bottom left of your browser, and keep them coming. We really love to hear what you've got on your mind and what you want to know from the presenters. The colorful widgets at the bottom also have additional resources, so feel free to look at those, including if you're having any technical support issues. A little bit about CMS Wire. We were founded in 2003, and we have over 400 editorial contributors who we publish a year. And hopefully you're all readers of it. If so, you'll know that we cover a wide range of topics, including the digital customer experience, the digital workplace, and information management. You can also join in on webinars like today or tweet jams like we're having tomorrow, and just keep up with us. And today's sponsor is Progress Site Infinity. You can find more about them on the website there, but a little bit about them. They are a content management and marketing analytics platform designed to maximize the agility needed to support enterprise-level digital marketing, and you're going to find out a lot more about that. As I mentioned, I am Siobhan Fagan. I'm the Managing Editor for CMS Wire, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. And then we have Christopher Peck. He is the sales engineer for Progress Site Infinity, and he is going to be giving you the main presentation. So right now, I'm just going to hand it off to Chris. Take it away.
Right. Thank you for the introduction. So let's get into the webinar today, which is Navigating Headless Content Management. And we're going to take a look at it because it's a hot topic within the industry, and certainly one that many organizations are trying to come to grips with. It's something where there's a lot of terminology out there. A lot of people are positioning solutions differently, and it can be tough to get a hold on really the core of what it really is and the benefits and challenges that it can offer. So we're going to go through all of that today to try to make sense of everything and hopefully give you a good overview of where to start if you are considering headless content management for your next project. To that end, a quick look at the agenda for today. I'm a big proponent of always defining our terms, and it's especially important when we are talking about something like headless content management when there's so much terminology floating around today. You tend to hear things about headless content management systems, hybrid content management systems, decoupled content management systems, API-first content management systems, head-optional systems. And these can all refer to different things sometimes depending upon who you're talking to and what they're talking about and in what situation. So I'm going to try to collapse that all down to some core concepts, and we'll talk about those and define those well so we can really have a deeper discussion about benefits and challenges. We're also going to be getting a demonstration of headless content delivery in action. So we will be taking a pause using the Sitefinity management system to walk through a few things so I can actually show you some of the things that we're talking about when we talk about benefits, showing you where the head is in a system, where the headless portion is within the system, and how that sort of whole content delivery works when we talk about content management. So without further ado, let's get into headless content management. So what is it? So it usually breaks down, in my mind, into two distinct ideas. To put those up, basically when people talk about it, and the thing that I want to actually put a line in the sand on is the difference between a headless content management system and headless content delivery. The first of those, the headless content management system, is a type of content management system, while headless content delivery is a feature of a content management system. The difference really being a a content management system that may still have may have headless content delivery as part of its feature set, but it's not what I would consider to be a headless content management system. So getting into the actual definitions that I'm going to be using here today, we are going to have headless content delivery, which essentially is from a very technical standpoint, a web service API that allows the serving of content as data to other systems with little to no design or technology limitation imposed. And went a little too fast. A headless content management system is a content management system that uses headless content delivery as its primary or often only means of delivering content. So again, why bother with the distinction? Well, first of all, so we can have a useful talk about it, but second of all, so that when you start thinking about the kind of systems that you're going to need to support your projects, you find people start to ask the wrong questions when they don't define these two things very well. They start to think about things as systems versus things as features. So if you're thinking about headless content management as a system, you start to ask, do I need a headless content management system? When what I think is probably the more useful thing to ask is, on the feature side, do we want to use headless content delivery? If so, where and to what extent? And the way in which you're going to determine that is going to be things based upon the project you're working on, the requirements you have, the budget you have, and also understanding the pluses and minuses of using headless content delivery in various different parts of that project. So without further ado, let's actually start off with the benefits of headless content delivery. So the first of these, and probably the most touted of these, is going to be headless delivery for omnichannel. I actually break up the benefits into two different areas, omnichannel and web. Omnichannel because it's kind of a new functionality that headless content delivery gets you. Headless content delivery for web, or using it for web-based projects, is more about how are we displacing the head, or how are we doing sort of a bring your own head thing when we are talking about those two feature sets and the benefits that they bring. So when we talk about benefits for the web, we're also going to be talking about some specific things within there. When we talk about the security of that system, the flexibility of the system, and some advantages with time to market for that system. Moving on. So the first and foremost of the functions that headless content delivery has is essentially to get content to whichever systems it needs to go to. So if we need content that's business user editable in our mobile applications, partner websites, internal applications, single page applications, you can get that content onto wearables. One thing that's actually become really hot right now is voice interfaces like Amazon Echoes, Google Home, things like that, being able to create skills for those, chatbots as well. You're also starting to see some of the new channels when people are starting to think more about augmented reality and virtual reality. And because within headless content management we're delivering data that's separate from presentation, we're really able to better support those as developers so we can build with your content on basically any of those devices. And this is becoming more important than ever. So I have a quote in here from McKinsey, which is actually a few years old now, just the idea that greater than 50% of customer interactions happen on a multi-event, multi-channel journey, and that's only grown. When that actually came out was really before we saw this explosion of the voice devices and the ways in which people are interacting and want to interact with their Alexas. So I have a couple in my house now, and I wasn't really interested a couple of years ago in them, but I now use them every day. And the more in which I can engage with companies on those devices or engage with content that I'm looking for in that manner is great for me. And the last thing that's really cool about omnichannel delivery is just that when we also package up our content just as the data really, it allows us to, I've talked about all sorts of different types of ways we could deliver it now, but it also makes sure that we'll be able to deliver it to any system that can reach out to the web in the future. If something else pops up that we didn't even see on the horizon, if you have a content management system that does support headless content delivery, you're going to be able to get your content out of that system into those channels in ways that you couldn't if it were a little more locked down. So really a fantastic feature and probably the biggest selling point of any content management system with headless content delivery. And I actually want to pause in terms of just doing the slideshow because I do want to show off headless content delivery in action and sort of show you how it looks a little bit within a content management system. So very quickly, I'm going to share my screen out, and hopefully we can get started into taking a look around headless content delivery. In my case, within Sitefinity, because that's of course the content management system that I work with. And hopefully in just a few seconds, you'll be able to see my screen. So what we're going to be looking at is going to be a demo website built on top of Sitefinity. Sitefinity is not a purely headless web content management system. It still has a head, but it also very much has this ability to deliver content headlessly. So even though we are able to do things like build pages within Sitefinity using drag and drop, and that is sort of all wrapped together, there's also the idea of being able to pull content out of Sitefinity and place it where it needs to go. So the place that I'm most interested in is going to be actually a part of this website called the Green Campaign, which is a page that was created that has a number of news articles on it that we could edit within the content management system. But even though I'm delivering these on the web, I'm also actually pushing these into a mobile application. So I've created a companion mobile application for our Quantum site. It's running, of course, in an Android emulator. But it allows me to do things like drill in, see news articles, drill into those news articles, and see them in various forms. This one also does have multilingual capability and actually the ability to log in. This is actually something that we might talk about a little bit later when it comes to the security and authentication piece that goes along with headless content delivery and why it's something you're possibly going to want to delve into depending upon the project you're working with. But ultimately, this ability just to deliver my content, my news articles, whatever it is, across various devices is pretty useful, especially when I want these content-enabled mobile apps. When I go into the back end of Sitefinity, however, what we actually see is, a full, pretty normal-looking content management system with the basic pieces that people are pretty familiar with. So we're breaking things into content that we can serve out either inside of a web page or headlessly, and pages. So this pages section is really sort of the head of the content management system that when we go into it, I'm really able to actually click into something like that Green Campaign page that we were just looking at and perform a lot of the actions that the head allows you to perform. Things like moving around content as needed, placing it in different areas, adding new content, filtering it easily as a business user, all of that. But because we are talking about headless, what we're more interested in is this content area where we have all of the content types that we have either out of the box or we've built out using our tooling. And if I go into the news articles, I can actually see all of the news articles that are within my content management system that are being used either on the web or delivered to other devices. So I might have one in here like my Quantum launches a new business notebook glue-on. And if I pop that open on here I think it's in my web development area. There it is, my business notebook glue-on. If I pop that open in an edit mode, I can make changes where maybe instead of notebook, I find that laptop is working better with our customers and publish that very quickly and easily. And you'll notice that I have things separated out in terms of the actual pieces of content they are, how it's made up in terms of title, full body copy, summary, if I wanted to add in categories or tagging, additional information, all of it's sort of broken out into something that may be very familiar having used content management systems where they do a good job of breaking up pages and presentation from the content itself. But once that's actually published, it's now live both anywhere I'm using it on my site and because I'm pushing it out via web services. If I quickly go back to my mobile application, and I go in here again, I can see my textual change is of course reflected. So very quickly and easily working out how those two things come together. Now, the nuts and bolts of this, and this will probably be more interesting for the developers in the audience, really come down to where we're serving out these, or spinning up these web services from. So within Sitefinity, and it's of course different in different content management systems, in our administration area, we have a web services area where I'm actually able to spin up RESTful OData v4 web services associated with any of the content that lives within my content management system. So I actually have one called Quantum Mobile, and if I click into it, I can actually see how I've named it, what the URL endpoint is, who can access content from this service. There are additional checks in here that we're doing to sort of help with the security of these services. Handling cores for cross-origin requests, and also the idea of being able to serve out all of our different content types and being able to change which content types we're serving up, or even going down into an advanced mode, maybe into our news items, and deciding which of those fields that we were filling out, like for example that title that we just changed, we're actually going to be able to serve up just using this interface to our mobile app or whatever other channel we're trying to deliver to. What is neat about these as well is that they are auto-documenting. So we have this full RESTful API for actually helping people consume these different web services. So if I look at my news items, I have a fully built-out API that's auto-documented that actually, when I call it, returns my news articles in JSON. So inside of this mobile app, which actually happens to be built in another Progress product called NativeScript that allows me to build out mobile applications for both iOS and Android at the same time using JavaScript, I have basically what may be familiar to a few of you if you've used it before, or if you've used Angular, as it is tied into Angular and does use that Angular type of syntax that we're actually using to build out this mobile application. But in the code here, it's all pretty normal in terms of getting our navigation to our various screens within our mobile application, and with setting some variables that we use throughout the application to tell our application about the endpoints it needs to be calling out to in order to get content from those endpoints. So in here we'll see that API Quantum Mobile News Items fragment. And that's of course the endpoint that we're using to grab our news items. Won't be going into this too much further today. If you do have questions about NativeScript, definitely feel free to contact us or to put them into chat. But I am actually going to switch back over and get back into the presentation after that quick overview. So that's ultimately headless content delivery in action, and it can be something that can be very useful for us when it comes to getting our content out there, whether or not we're using a headless CMS or just a CMS that does have headless content delivery. In any event, let's move on to some of the other great benefits if we are using headless content delivery in a pure headless mode, and we're talking about actually building the site from scratch and just using those services to actually populate that site with content. The first of which that I did want to talk about is the idea of headless for web with respect to security. So when you are actually delivering stuff just over the web services, and you essentially do have this decoupled architecture where you have an editing server that is actually pushing the content up to that live delivery server that's actually serving up web pages, you have a nice strong separation of concerns. You can harden that content server more, and you can place more controls when it comes to who can actually get into that, which can really help you in terms of protecting against any unauthorized access. There also is the benefit that when you've separated this out, you don't have any front-end code running on your content creation server. So anything that's wrong with the front-end code that's been written, whether it's something that's not being done correctly with form input and sanitization, it's significantly less likely it's going to get all the way back into that content creation server, that headless web content management system, and really change anything. Next thing I wanted to talk about, which is another huge selling point for going completely headless and going headless with headless content management on the web is the idea that when we go with headless content management as a developer, when I'm just getting data that I'm using to build out what I'm trying to do on the web and building out the pages all by myself and just inserting the data where it needs to go, I'm given a huge amount of flexibility in the technology stack I use. So I'm able to use anything that can really make a web service call. It's a lot easier to make things like single-page applications, to integrate that data into existing websites, to use the new latest hotness if it's Node.js, Vue, Angular, React, whatever I want, it's easier for me to use because I'm in full control of that stack, which also can get into having better control for your designers. If you want to use an uncommon layout that doesn't sort of work as well with that common sort of drag-drop page creation that a lot of people are used to when they're using content management systems that do have a head. Last thing I want to talk about when it comes to benefits of using headless content delivery on the web is that for web projects, you're going to probably get a faster time to market. Ultimately, as a developer, when you're building within a content management system with a head, there are a lot of hoops that we have to jump through when we build things out, because we're building out pieces of pages that can be dragged and dropped and sort of working within the confines of a framework that allows for that business user editability on a page level. And with those taken away, we can often get your site out there from the point where we decide to develop it to the point where it's actually live to the public much, much faster. So that wraps up our talk about the benefits of headless content delivery. Now I want to talk about some of the challenges with headless content delivery. And when I talk about these, I do want to say that when it comes to challenges, it's not that these can't be overcome. These are certainly a lot of them, just things that we have to think about when we are looking at headless content delivery and where we want to use it and how we're developing with it to make sure that what we're doing is something that makes sense, that we've accounted for all of the factors, and that we have a way to deal with some of the drawbacks of dealing with content headlessly. So again, I'm breaking this up into those two things of omnichannel and for the web. Talking a little bit more about security, some business user concerns, search engine optimization, and time to market. So going back to headless for omnichannel, ultimately, headless for omnichannel is, in my opinion, one of the best things about headless and getting your content out there. And there aren't a whole lot of drawbacks because there really isn't a better way to get your content out there that I can think of. But the things you do have to consider a little bit when you're thinking about headless for omnichannel is that when you start to address other channels and when you start to think about building out other channels, each channel you add is expensive because much like building a website from scratch or much like building a mobile application from scratch, it takes developer time, and that takes, of course, money and budget to support that developer time and to get that channel to market and integrated with your content management system. My advice to y'all is to make sure that when you are planning out projects, there's a lot of cool stuff out there, a lot of shiny stuff when it comes to, man, we should really deliver all of our content, all of our news articles for our insurance company. We want to deliver them via augmented reality to our users. And that's a great thing to want, but it's not likely that you're going to get a whole lot of ROI out of that. So really try to focus in on the channels that are going to make an impact to your business. And also, with those channels, don't think of them in a vacuum. Take advantage of the developer tooling that's out there to try to make your developers as productive as possible. We at Progress do a lot of developer tooling as well. We saw a little bit of it with NativeScript with that write once, run anywhere. So you can take advantage of things to try to keep costs down, but still deliver great applications and great content across channels. Second thing wanted to hit upon had to do with security as well. And this comes down to the difference between the security of a web content management system and the security of a solution. So when you are dealing with delivering content headlessly on the web, and we're working with a headless web content management system, it's taking over less of what we're actually doing as a solution set. So that solution set now contains the actual building out or use of a head that is going to be using a lot of technology that may have its own security issues. And also, because of the disconnect between data and the way in which it's displayed on pages, some of the ways in which we think about how we restrict access to content or restrict access to pages or deal with our users is something that we're going to have to think about when we are actually building out that head for our headless content management system. So how is our authentication solution? So when we're taking user credentials in order to allow them access to different pages on our website, is that going to tie back into our web content management system? Is that going to be an absolutely separate thing? Are we also going to be dealing with permission sets on data? Things of that nature are going to be something that we need to think about. The other thing is that while content management systems that are sort of what we might term to be traditional content management systems that are purely focused on the web have had issues in the past, sometimes like WordPress with there's a hack that comes out for it and you have to patch it really quickly or else you risk getting your site hacked into. You end up with some of that as well within the head, but it's a little more fragmented. So instead of keeping track of is WordPress secure or even is WordPress plus your plugin secure, it's going to be, is my CMS secure, first of all, which it probably will be a bit more secure, but also is everything that I used to create the head for my CSS, for that presentation layer, secure? So if I need to do updates to Node.js, if I need to do updates to Angular or jQuery or whatever it is that I used, I do have to keep on top of that. So definitely do think about that. Another thing that I wanted to talk about when it comes to challenges and concerns are going to be business user concerns. When you see what you can do with headless web content management and you see sort of the finished product and you see how flexible it is in design on the web and where you can put data in all sorts of places that may not follow the traditional grid system, and your designers are real happy because there are absolutely zero limitations, you do also have to realize that that comes at a cost often, unless you've actually thought about it, worked with it, and have a good solution for it. So one of the things I showed during my demonstration is just that idea of page creation and design. We're taking that capability more or less away from a business user and putting it in the hands of a developer. So unless we've dealt with it, creating a new page may require developer involvement, especially if it's going to be a bit different, has a different layout than already created pages. We also do have to think about how we're going to deal with some of the things that the head on a content management system already deals with for us. So things like URL structure, important for SEO, any redirects we want to do if we decide to move pages around, and also how we're building out our navigation bar if we are going to be doing stuff like adding in new pages, or if we want to create pages that are maybe landing pages that have a limited navigation bar, microsites, things like that. Another thing to think about is that with that disconnect, that decoupling, you are also going to really separate the relationship between content and the journey through that content. So when I create my content within a content management system with a head, at the very least, I should be able to figure out which pages that content is being used on pretty easily. So when I edit a news article, I know kind of where things are going to change. When that's actually broken apart, unless we've dealt with it, it can be a lot harder to tell when I change something in my CMS, where does this change my content? So I might have an idea of one place it'll change, but if it's being reused, maybe I don't know about that, and you can run into issues where you're accidentally changing things in channels and on pages that you didn't want changed that aren't getting properly QA'd. So keeping a good idea of where your content is being used is going to be important. The other things that the heads on content management systems tend to offer tends to be also a very deep treatment of personalization and A/B testing. Absolutely tools to get around this and to do personalization and A/B testing without a content management system. You'll see tools like, for example, Optimizely that do this. The content management systems that do them tend to do them in a little more user-friendly and a deeper way in terms of being able to be content aware when they're doing certain types of content management and personalization, but certainly still something to think about. So getting down to some of the last few things, when we are doing headless for web, you have to be really careful about your SEO because your pages aren't necessarily being built server-side. So if you're planning on calling in your data just on the client side, you do have to jump through some hoops to make sure that the indexing engines at Google or any of the other indexing engines are going to properly be able to capture any data that's associated with your pages, and also making sure that you are giving people a place to actually store and place page-level metadata, so page titles or keywords or terms that you actually want to get in there that are important for SEO, and making those business user editable. One of the things that people tend to do also to get around the idea of, oh, I don't want to, do all this stuff to try to make sure that Google calls all of my AJAX correctly so that I'm getting my content actually on these pages before they're getting indexed, is that they'll say, oh, I'll just try to make those calls on the server side. And that actually will work because those pages are sort of pre-rendered or pre-built before they're actually being crawled. The only issue that people run into with that has to do with server-side caching. So if you are going to actually be doing calls and server-side rendering on every single page load, that's going to be expensive on your servers. If you're doing caching, you do need to figure out a way to change or check back if there's new content on a regular basis, or deal with some sort of cache and validation mechanism to make sure that the content that's being provided on the web interface is the most recent content. So you're not waiting until that cache runs out until for too long if there's a new news article or there's a new piece of content that really should be displayed on your site. Final thing I want to talk to you about is time to market, and this is a very different type of time to market than what I talk about when we're talking about deciding we want a website to the point where that website goes live. So all of these things, especially with the developers in control of so much more, can make a lot of marketing campaigns take longer if they do require things that are generally taken care of a content management system that has a head of some sort. So if we're doing marketing campaigns and we need to do things like create microsites, landing pages, layout changes, adding sections to already existing pages, things like that can be more difficult, can require more developer time. So our marketing campaigns after the site goes live, as we need to do changes or run things, can take a bit longer. So in any event, I do want to actually wrap up and hopefully talk about the things that we've talked about here, some takeaways that you can take and think about when you're thinking about your next project. And those really are that headless content delivery does exist separately from headless content management systems. There's a difference between the two, even though there's a lot of media out there that does seem to confuse these two things. Systems with headless content delivery do provide a lot of real value, especially in delivering content across many devices. That's, in many ways, it's bread and butter. The fact that headless content delivery, when used for creating websites and web pages, does have some pros and cons based on what we're used to or what we may be used to from previous experience when it comes to developer flexibility and the pros and cons of that. And I would urge you that when you are building out your project plan, to take some time in the early phases to consider which mix of these things is going to be right for you. So you may want to use this headless content delivery, of course, for omni-channel, but not for the web, or you may want to use it for certain parts of your web experience. All sorts of mixes of these things. It's very much a spectrum as opposed to a, do I want to use it for everything or do I want to use it for nothing? And certainly, you can learn more about headless content delivery at sitefinity.com. We have a few links within here at stuff that we've talked about when we talk about headless with Sitefinity. It's currently a hot thing that we talk about internally a lot. You can check out some of the great blog posts that we have on the topics, along with all sorts of other things that we talk about when it comes to helping out marketers and developers navigate the content management world. And if you liked anything that you saw when we were walking around that Sitefinity content management system, you can certainly schedule a demo and possibly talk to me again. And we can walk you through some of the other things more in depth when it comes to headless content management. To that end, thank you for joining us today for our webinar on headless content management. And I did want to turn things back over to Siobhan so that we can start our QA session.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a really informative presentation. I definitely learned a lot from you. And it looks as if you inspired quite a few questions from our audience. So if you have any further questions for Chris from Sitefinity, please get them in using the module on your bottom left. And we're just going to hop right into the questions because we really want to get to all of them. But if you had any thoughts or feedback on the webinar, let us know what you're up to at CMS Wire or at Sitefinity. Let's dive in, shall we? Okay, Chris, first question. You talked about a lot of different types of CMSs. And if you had to work with just one type, what would that be?
So I would personally work with a content management system that supports headless content delivery but does have a head of one sort or another. The benefit really being that when you have the head, you can choose not to use the head of your content headless, or you can choose not to use the head of the content management system and just deliver things all via headless, whereas with a headless content management system, you don't have that option. The reason that people usually tend to choose one over the other is that sort of that more full-featured system does tend to be a little bit more expensive, depending upon what you're going with.
Okay, so flexibility definitely sounds like a strong selling point there. We've got another question for you. This one is coming from John, and he wants to know if you support iOS in your mobile app development.
We absolutely do. So with NativeScript, that was really why we created the whole thing, and we actually work a little bit with Google on that because it follows Angular so closely. But the real point is being able to leverage current developer skill sets with JavaScript and XML to define your screens and your application logic, share them around as needed, but still use a native UI where it's not you're not using web views in both of those systems. You're using true iOS views and you're using true Android views. So.
Excellent. Next one is coming in from Alan, and Alan wants to know, is Sitefinity working to provide interaction or integration with SharePoint 365? So
Sitefinity does have integration with SharePoint Online. And when it comes to the terminology around that, SharePoint Online versus SharePoint 365, I'm not totally solid on that. And it can do things like pull content when it comes to documents or SharePoint lists into Sitefinity content types and sort of sync those two back and forth so you can leverage maybe SharePoint for something internal when it comes to having advantage of those SharePoint document collaboration and all the great stuff SharePoint does there, but still having something more flexible to deliver content out to a wider audience when it comes to public content management.
Great. I hope that answered your question, Alan. This question, actually, I'm curious about, Chris. What would you say, and I know you're partial, but what would you say is the #1 reason for using Sitefinity over other CMSs?
So the #1 reason that people tend to work with Sitefinity has to probably be, I'm going to cheat and give you 2 reasons. So first of all, it is business user usability. Our user experience and the user design when you're actually within the back end of Sitefinity and editing content is much more simple and clean while still retaining a lot of power on the developer end so that we can use content in many different ways, support many different designs, and support a lot of the developer tooling that a developer might want when it comes to actually building things out. So it tends to be the user experience there and sort of that developer tooling.
Rob wants to know which industry or verticals are taking advantage of headless content delivery. Can you speak to any verticals that you see in action?
It tends to vary a little bit. It's certainly mostly used in B2C, which of course is very broad. You do see it with fast-moving consumer goods. You also do see it in industries where, like financial, especially with things like insurance and you also do see it in healthcare. So most of the time, what we've seen mostly people using headless content delivery for has been that the mobile application, the companion mobile application that people are using for their day-to-day interactions with a company, where content is mixed with interactions that are sort of one-to-one interactions. So within a banking app, being able to deliver small amounts of news or information to your customers very simply and easily within the application, or within a healthcare application where there might be something with managing your healthcare insurance, but also having that news alongside it or those articles alongside it that are more, encouraging people to use certain things that might be beneficial for the healthcare organization when it comes to taking better care of yourself, or telling you about, great new ways to diet or exercise, or who to contact at the hospital, that kind of thing. That tends to be the most common use case, so that those tend to be the verticals that we see the most out of it with.
Excellent. So we've got one from Carrie, and Carrie wants to know, with headless content delivery, can you share content from sources such as LinkedIn, newspapers, etc.? She said maybe not the full content given copyright issues, but can you at least share previews of articles with links to go out to that particular website? So how would that work in headless?
Yeah, so it's ultimately when it comes to the idea of sharing, it depends a little bit on how you're developing. So when we think about stuff like LinkedIn, or if we're dealing with newspapers, if that is actually digitized, of course, it's going to be just a question of capturing the link as part of that content, and then any additional flavor text that you want to go along with it when you actually are, putting it up on your website with that link out to sort of the full copy or something like that. So it really has a lot more to do with that data model and just capturing those things that your developers need to be able to put that on your website or within your mobile application in order to launch people over to that content that may be external.
Excellent. Thomas wants to know, any concerns about time overhead when using multiple web service calls on a page? For example, a financial advisor site has a page where clients log in and configure the preferred info, financial market data, maybe up to 30 content items, each needing separate REST calls. Will this be prohibitively slow?
It depends on how those calls are done, ultimately. So a single web service call does not take a lot of time usually, especially with some of the systems that we set up for high availability or something like that. When you're talking about a content page making something like 30 web service calls, you are going to see some performance hit, and how much is really going to depend largely on how those calls need to be made. So if they're calls that need to be made one after another in sequence, and each call depends on data from another call, you are going to see a slowdown. And ultimately, you might be better served with re-architecting that API or writing your own web service, which is something that we do within Sitefinity when sort of just the simpler operations aren't going to work. That's still tied into the Sitefinity API that's actually handling some of that data manipulation before it sends over and consolidating those web services calls down to as few as possible, so that you can do that. If it's 30 and you're actually able to run them asynchronously, it shouldn't be that bad, as long as each individual piece that you're calling out to itself has a reasonably quick time where it's popping that information back.
Excellent. Chris, you are very popular at the moment. The questions keep coming in for you. So I am going to combine two people's questions, or sort of do a two-parter. We have one question from Peter, and then I'm going to ask a follow-up from Ronnie. Is there a simple way to think about the distinction between headless and decoupled CMS models? So that's Peter's question. And then Ronnie's is, what is the difference between headless and semi-headless?
So unfortunately, I could try to give you an answer here, but it would really be my personal feelings about these things. And when I talked about early on the idea that people within the industry are calling different types of headless all sorts of different things, and they aren't, depending upon who you ask, those terms are going to be different. I really meant it. I've done a lot of research in the lead up to this webinar, and you will see people using decoupled synonymously with just headless in general. You will see just headless versus all sorts of things, and until we in the industry decide exactly what all of these things mean, the terminology doesn't mean all that much, unfortunately, which is sort of why I make the distinction I do, and I try to keep it as simple as possible. So.
All right, I hope that helped both of you. We've got a question from Steve. Google states that as of summer 2018, they will support dynamically generated content via AJAX. Have you found any issues so far with that, Chris?
Not too much. It certainly works, but the thing that that you still have to do when you are building out is definitely take a look at Google's documents with respect to the way in which they want you to organize your web service calls in order to support their crawling. Because there have been, over time, the tweaks that you've needed to do in order to make all of the AJAX calls work for them have been a little bit different. So it's more a developer concern. I haven't seen huge issues with it when you've thought about it and when you've tried to adhere to their standards. And the place in which it mostly comes in as an issue for SEO is going to be especially things like H1s, getting those onto those pages and getting those, make sure that you're rendering those correctly. And the idea of also, if you're doing SEO, not trying to do certain types of manipulation of the head when you are actually calling that in client side. So it depends. The other thing is that it's not, while Google is, at least in the United States, absolutely the leader in search, the differences between that and other search engines that are hugely popular in other areas of the world can make it hard, especially if you're trying to grow your business internationally.
Excellent. So you touched on this a little bit when you discussed the verticals earlier, but Rich wanted to know what some of the most common uses of headless content delivery you've seen. Do you have any others you want to share with the audience, Chris?
No, and just to be very clear about this, the two that are the most common are using it on the web and using it for mobile. Those two use cases tend to dominate because those are the two use cases that seem to be, just the biggest within marketing and within organizations in general. The use case that we're starting to see more of is also the voice assistant use case. And the thing also on the web is, as it breaks down as well, the other use case that you see a lot of is you may or may not choose to do your main site or the major part of the project within a content management system that has a head, but you do see a lot of people delivering content headlessly to already built or legacy systems where you just need a little bit of content enablement. So, for example, online banking systems where you're still getting your statements and all of that through the online banking system, but maybe there's a sidebar or something that we want to content enable and make more marketer friendly so that they can put promotions in there or news articles or something so that they can sort of interact with their customers when they're inside of that legacy system. So, yep.
Great. So we have a question from another Peter, and this Peter asks, do I understand correctly that pages are not managed in the CMS and that the headless CMS just serves the content blocks to be rendered in the page? Can you tell more about the reasoning around this? This sounds like this could be a whole webinar in itself, but I'll let you take a stab at it, Chris.
Yes, for the most part. There are a couple of systems that I don't know exactly how to classify that do some strangeness with sort of, it's kind of headless but kind of not, that will allow you some level of page control. But it's less about, and when you're doing headless, in my opinion, well, you aren't thinking about it just as content blocks that are being put on the page. You're actually manipulating the data as it goes onto the page, so that different pieces of the content are going to be using different HTML tags and actually taking advantage of real structure on a page when it comes to the title in our news article being possibly like an H3 tag, the body copy being in a paragraph tag, an image possibly being used as a banner image or somewhere inside of that paragraph, so on and so forth. So the ways in which those pieces of data come together, when done correctly, you do want to have a lot of separation of that content to give the developers the control over the data, as opposed to basically a headless content management system just firing off HTML that you want to put somewhere, because fully composed HTML and firing it off like that gives you less flexibility, because you have to pull it apart before you can put it back together in different ways. So, yep.
Matthew has a question specific to the platform, and he asks, is there a way to leverage Sitefinity's targeting features in headless content delivery?
There are some. So we actually have a separate system called the Digital Experience Cloud, and the Digital Experience Cloud is very integrated with Sitefinity for delivering content to targeted content to different people on the web. But what's neat about the Digital Experience Cloud is that it also does do, you can also use it for user tracking on different channels if you want, because there's a web service API, a headless API, if you will, that allows us to call out to it if we know who somebody is. Like, for example, in our mobile application, that we have them logged in. We can use that information about that from that login to reach out to the Digital Experience Cloud, find out maybe something about a lead score that we're running for them, or a persona, previous interactions that have been had, what like other, they visited us on the web and they viewed these 5 web pages, all that, and then actually being able to personalize the experience on mobile. The one thing I will say about that is just having that is great, and knowing that somebody can do that in mobile is good, but the harder portion with mobile, and sort of in essence some of the harder portions if we're building something without a head, is that the developer has to take advantage of kind of what happens when we find out somebody is in a particular persona. So there does need to be some developer involvement to get that done.
Great. This next question kind of goes back to the content display question. This is from Mike, and he's wanting to know how you've seen businesses solve the problem that you raised during the business user concern section for understanding all places a piece of content is displayed on the site or across all channels.
It's one of those things that I've seen solutions to that I don't like a whole lot, but I think that they will be coming around the bend soon as somebody does figure out the actual ways to relate types of content. Most of the time what ends up happening is that part of the content area is going to be, there is an additional part of that content that's being entered in where notes are taken. Those notes are, of course, never actually served out anywhere or used anywhere, where you are making notes of where something is being used and links to that particular thing, or a note that, oh, we're also using this on mobile, or we're also using that on the web. The other thing that people do in this case is they also often will make taxonomies that can give you some good ideas about where something is being used or on which channel at the very least. So in terms of tagging a news article and saying, okay, this is tagged with a certain name of our mobile app, or this is tagged with additional metadata that goes along with it. Ultimately, it would be great if the system solved it for us, but I haven't seen a good implementation that does that headlessly.
All right. So our final question for today comes from Bronco. And the question is, you said Sitefinity isn't fully headless content management system. Can you please explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so in a certain sense, Sitefinity is a fully headless content management system in that it offers pretty much all of the features that a headless content management system offers. I just say that it isn't because it also does offer the head. So it's like that headless content delivery, and that's why I made that distinction early on between feature and system. So Sitefinity is a system that does sort of what most of these headless content management systems do and more. A headless content management system, as I see it and the way I've seen it in the industry, is much more a pared down version of something that was once much greater. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Chris. You've been put on the hot spot for a while, and you did great. This webinar has been recorded, so a link to the on-demand video will be emailed to all of you in the audience in a few business days. Thanks again to Chris Peck for speaking us and to Progress Sitefinity for sponsoring today's event. And if your company is interested in sponsoring a webinar, please email us. But thanks again, Chris. Thanks to all of our audience for the wonderful questions, and have a great day.